Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second installment of the Future of Everything series. Today's topic is the changing world of work. It's great to see so many people attending for this very relevant topic. Today's speaker is Professor Emma Parry, the renowned expert in human resource management and the head of the Changing World of Work group. Professor Parry will cut through the rhetoric today by examining the evidence for future trends and disruptions to the world of work and discuss the implications of these for organizations and individuals alike. So I'll be handing over shortly to our speaker, but just a bit of housekeeping first. This webinar is being recorded. So participants today will be muted to ensure the sound quality for all attendees, but we would like to hear from you during the session, and there'll be plenty of opportunities to ask questions. So if you have any questions, please use the chat feature, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll get through as many questions as we can at the end of the masterclass, and then anything we don't have time for, we can answer directly after the event. And if you miss anything, don't worry, we will be sending out a link to the webinar recording via email as soon as it's available. But if you've not already done so, please ensure that your name that you're using in the session, in the Zoom, is the same as your registration name, so that we know that you attended and can send you that follow-up and send you that recording. So yeah, that's great. For those of you who are just arriving now, welcome and thank you for joining us. And I think that's all from me. We can jump into the main event now. So I'll hand over to our speaker, Professor Emma Parry. Over to you.
Thanks, Aidan. Thanks very much for that introduction. And good afternoon, everybody. And thank you so much for taking some time out of your busy day to join me for this webinar this afternoon. It's really great to see so many people on the call, and I can see the numbers are still going up, which is fantastic. Okay, so for those of you that don't know me, and I can see lots of familiar faces and names on the call, which is lovely to see. As Aidan said, I'm the head of the Changing World of Work group here at Cranfield. I've been at Cranfield School of Management for 20 years this year, which is, apart from being quite scary, I have to say, means I've now spent quite a lot of time looking at this topic. And over the last few years, I've become more and more interested in how the external context and the changes in that context, whether that's about the economic cycle, whether it's about shifting demographics, or whether it's about technology, perhaps, how those changes affect work, the workplace, and the workforce, and then what that means for us as employers or us in organizations in terms of how we recruit, retain, and manage the people that we need. So what I'm going to do today in the next 30 minutes or so is share just a few insights from my work. I could talk about this forever, as people that know me will tell you, but I'm just going to give you a flavor of this and get you thinking just a little bit about what the changing world of work might look like, what the evidence says, and what it might mean for you and your organization. And I put this cartoon up, and some of you that have seen me speak before might have seen me use this cartoon before, but I really like this cartoon because I think it does encapsulate how sometimes we feel about the changing world of work, because we just think perhaps that we've got a handle on what's going on. We just think we've got an idea of what's going to happen in the future, and then something comes along. A big pandemic, perhaps, of course, because that's what happened to us all a couple of years ago. And then everything changes and all predictions are off the table. And really, to be honest, this is what both excites me and interests me about this area, because, of course, things are changing all the time and it's a really dynamic area. So I think this is what I'm going to do today, is spend a little bit of time drawing on just a few trends to give you a flavour of some of the trends moving forward, and what we might expect in the world of work. But first of all, I want to ask you to think for a few moments and just ask you to reflect. So when you think about the future world of work, what is it that you think about? And I'm not going to ask people to tell me, but if you do want to type in the chat, of course, you're very, very welcome to. It's always lovely for me to have an idea of what people are thinking. But I'm just going to give you a few seconds now just to perhaps reflect yourself on what you think when you think about the future of work or the changing world of work. Brilliant. Lots of people typing. I love it. Wow, fantastic. A few people talking about flexibility there, different types of jobs, different generations. Cliff talking about the skills gap, digitalization, automation, no more commuting. Wouldn't that be nice? Oh, technology, AI. So a few people thinking about technology there. Brilliant, fantastic. And thank you so much for those of you that are typing, because if nothing else, it helps me to know that people are paying attention, which is always nice. Brilliant. So lots of people talking about hybrid working and flexibility there. One of the reasons I ask you that question, apart from the fact that it's nice, I think, for you to focus on what you think about at the beginning of this, is because generally this is a topic that we hear a lot about. And there's a lot of rhetoric out there about the future of work. You know, you can open any magazine, especially in my world, in the HR world, and I know we've got quite a few HR people on the call today, you know, and you'll hear something that's talking, just looking at this slide, you know, perhaps about technology. So some of you mentioned technology, about hybrid working, about work-life balance. Of course, a lot in the last couple of years about our little friend there, COVID-19, and about Brexit, and also, of course, importantly, about sustainability. And just to highlight the picture in the middle at the bottom, we do also sometimes hear this more dystopian view of the future, you know, that nobody's going to have any jobs and we're all going to be living in poverty. And the world is going to collapse because AI and technology are going to take over. So we see a number of different rhetorics, if you like, out there. And one of the things that I really wanted to do today is really spend some time focusing on 4 of those rhetorics, and I'll tell you which 4 in a moment, and really looking at some of the evidence behind those, so that we can begin to think about what the evidence really says about the future of work. But first of all, let me tell you what I think about when I think about the changing world of work or the future of work. And this is a diagram that's come out of some work that I've been doing recently for the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory. And this is based really on all of the evidence that's out there and some research that we've done about what makes up the future of work. And I mentioned earlier that my big interest is really about context. And when I think about the changing world of work, I think about context and how the context is changing. Because, of course, work doesn't change on its own. It's a reaction to what's happening in the world. And when we talk about context, just briefly, we generally talk about 2 different things. So we talk about societal trends. So these are the things that are ongoing, perhaps quite incremental. They might move quite slowly, although it might not always feel like that. You know, so they're ongoing, they happen over a long period of time. So things like the economic cycle, so that boom and bust cycle that we all live through, technological advancement. So, you know, in the time that I've been doing work about technology, when I started, we were talking all about information systems, through to social media, to mobile technology, and now much more about machine learning and AI. We might talk about demographics. So I've done quite a lot of work around the aging workforce, for example. You know, we know we've got more women and ethnic minorities in the workplace, and so on and so forth. And then finally, and of course, something we're talking more and more about in relation to organizations is the environment, and this important move towards sustainability. So these are the ongoing trends. We also talk about disruptions, or what I've called disruptions. And these are the things that happen much more quickly, perhaps more unexpectedly, and they tend to be more defined in relation to time. And in the UK, at least, we're lucky enough to be dealing with two of these at the moment. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, which people are dealing with, of course, all over the world. And in the UK as well, our exit from the European Union. And these are things that have happened in a much shorter time span, and perhaps were less expected and have had a more sudden effect. And I think the important thing about disruptions is that they not only have an impact on the world of work, but they also disrupt the ongoing trends. So, for example, we know that use of technology has accelerated because of COVID-19. We know, of course, that both COVID-19 and Brexit has had an impact on the economic cycle. So these things are very interrelated. And then when I talk about outcomes, and I am going to focus mostly on outcomes today, generally I talk about things in three areas. So we might talk about skills, you know, are the skills that we need in the workforce or as an organization or as an individual, if we're thinking about our careers, do they change as a result of what's happening in the world? So the obvious ones here, of course, are digital skills or green skills in relation to sustainability. We also talk about organizational ways of working. So lots of you, when you were typing in the chat, mentioned hybrid working or flexibility. You know, there are things that organizations are grappling with at the moment, and we will come back to that in a moment. And then, of course, we talk about individual behaviors. And we know that the context and the changing context affects what people want, what they expect, and how they behave in the workplace. And a couple of you in the chat mentioned generational differences and changing attitudes, and I will come back to that again later in the presentation. So just to do some framing, this is when I talk about the changing world of work, this diagram here really encapsulates what I mean. Okay, so this is what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to focus on 4 areas, a couple of which are much longer term in relation to trends, and some of those are things that I think are very pertinent at the moment. So I wanted to bring them up because I think there's a lot of chat and rhetoric about them at the moment. So what I'm going to do is move through each of these in turn. And then we'll talk a little bit about the rhetoric and then about the evidence behind each of those. Okay, so technological advancement. This is obviously a long-term trend and something that people have been talking about, certainly for my entire lifetime, which is quite a long time at this point. You know, so we've seen headlines like this forever. And do you know, I can remember as a kid watching this program we used to have in the UK that some of you might remember called Tomorrow's World. And, you know, and this used to talk all the time about robotics and how robots were taking over, and we'd all have robots in our houses and doing all of our housework for us. I think we've got about as far as vacuuming in some cases, and that's it. And that nobody would have a job anymore. We still have these headlines. These are recent headlines that say the same kind of thing. You know, this idea that automation is really going to take over jobs and that we'll have large job losses because of this. So I did want to spend a little bit of time just thinking about technological advancement and what it might mean for the world of work. Okay, so firstly, it would be remiss of me and false, of course, to not recognize that, of course, technologies are advancing and we are seeing increased reliance on digital technologies. And as I said before, this has grown dramatically as advances have gone on. I mean, certainly when I was younger, you know, we wouldn't be carrying, look, I've got my mobile phone, it's not very far away from me even today, although it is off. You know, so things like mobile technologies, social media have really changed the way that we operate. And moving now, of course, into thinking about how we use more emerging technologies around artificial intelligence, around things like blockchain, sensors and wearables. I also have a particular brand of watch on that monitors my heart rate and stuff. So we are really seeing big changes over time in both advancements in technology and how we use them. And importantly, I think at the moment is that our adoption of technology has accelerated since the pandemic. So of course, the obvious one here is about communication and collaboration. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I certainly wouldn't have been sitting here like this, doing this. You'd have been in a room in front of me and, you know, we would have been having this conversation perhaps, albeit a slightly different one. You know, and we've really become very reliant, of course, on things like Zoom and Teams over the last couple of years. But also we're seeing a real uptake of things like artificial intelligence and robotics for things like cleaning, in agriculture and in some other industries. And just to draw your attention to this picture here, this is actually my own photo. And if any of you are local to where I live around Milton Keynes, these little friends here will be very familiar to you because these are Starship delivery robots that we have in Milton Keynes. And I think they're a really good example of how use of technology has grown over the last 2 years since the pandemic. Because before the pandemic, you would have seen these little guys you know, very, very occasionally around the streets of Milton Keynes. In the last couple of years, you can't walk down the street without falling over one of them, because the idea of having your groceries delivered by robot has really taken off in my area, and I think they're a good example of that. I also wanted to talk a little bit about automation and just to sense check, I guess, some of the conversations and those headlines that I showed about automation. Of course, we will lose some jobs because of automation. You know, there are predictions, I've put US figures up here, but there are predictions that a relatively large number of jobs will be automated. But I think we also need to realize that the prediction is that these will lead to changes in people's jobs for the most part, rather than people losing their jobs. So the numbers of people that will need to find a new line of work is actually significantly lower than that. And in terms of employers, what this means, of course, is that we really need to have a handle on what's happening with skills in our workforce. And as skills begin to become obsolete or new skills are needed, we really need to have good systems in place for reskilling and upskilling and then redeploying our workforce. And I think this is the real emphasis in relation to automation at the moment. A couple of things to say about that. Firstly, automation is nothing new. And any of you that work in manufacturing will know that this is a very long-term trend. You know, again, we were talking a lot about robotics in manufacturing 20 plus years ago. So again, this is a long-term trend. I think we have this feeling that things like machine learning and artificial intelligence are different and they're moving faster. But actually, there's very, very little evidence that that's true. So actually, this is part of quite an incremental long-term trend. Secondly, the emphasis that the evidence suggests is very much on augmentation rather than automation. So really, the evidence suggests that actually we're, over the next few years at least, we'll really be using technology to support humans, to help us be more effective in our jobs, to perhaps remove bits of the jobs you know, that the technology can do better. But it will really be a case of human machine teaming and us working with technology rather than whole jobs being automated. And I guess the other thing to say here to sense check this is that there's also a really high level of job creation from technology. I mean, there's a whole raft of jobs, and I've listed some of them here, that weren't even invented quite a few years ago. And I love this stat from the Institute of the Future 5 years ago this was, but the stat still holds, that actually most of our jobs in 2030 haven't even been created yet, or hadn't been created in 2017 anyway. So actually we are seeing a massive state of job creation from technology as well. So I think it's really important that we think about the positive sides of the picture as well as the negative there. And just to reflect for a few moments before I move on to the next trend, on what the implications of technology and technological advancement might be within organizations. Because, of course, while I've just said that the impact on automation might not be quite as high as we thought it would be, of course, we do know, excuse me, that there are some things that we need to be thinking about, especially if we are in HR or we're an employer or a manager within an organization, in order to prepare our workforce and our organizations for technological advancement in the future. So the first of these is really to think about how you might use technology. And the one thing I would say about this, because again, this is a whole subject that we could do a whole webinar about, is don't adopt technology for the sake of the technology. And this is something we see happen over and over again. It should be effectiveness, processes first, not technology. So if you are thinking about some sort of digitalization or some sort of digital transformation, then think about your processes, how you can improve your processes, and then think about whether technology is the way to do that. But there are some great benefits to be had, of course, in using some of the technologies that are emerging at the moment. The other thing, and I'm going to talk a bit more about this in a moment, is, of course, we know that our ways of working are affected by technology. We know that there's a job to be done to think about how we can utilize technology to facilitate more effective, perhaps more flexible ways of working. So it's important that we think about that. And also alongside that, I think there's a real conversation going on at the moment about how we use offices. And in fact, this is a conversation that's grown since the pandemic, but it's not a completely new conversation. We saw some companies, Santander and some others, thinking much more about their office space before the pandemic. But, you know, I think it's really important now to think about, well, how can we design office spaces that promote collaboration, promote interaction, promote relationship building, so that we're thinking about these things. And the importance of these things, and when we're in the office, knowing that we're likely to be doing the focus stuff when we're at home. And of course, I don't know if any of you have seen this, but in the last couple of weeks, Google have released the designs of their new offices, which are really designed for collaboration, for relationship building, and for hybrid working. So we are seeing some really good examples of that actually beginning to come out. I don't want to go into these in any detail, but of course, the other implication of automation certainly is to think more about restructuring. We often talk about this idea of hollowing out of the middle in organizations. So this idea that actually we're going to, you know, that actually the jobs at the bottom and the jobs at the top probably won't be automated. It's the ones in the middle. And then how do we structure our organizations? How do we lead organizations if we've got an automated middle? And then alongside that, as I said already, really think about, you know, what are the implications in relation to skills within the organization, and how do we need to reskill and upskill people to address those. And then finally, just to highlight, and again, this is not a new conversation, but it is a conversation that's come very much into the spotlight since the pandemic, is that we know that as we have increased connectivity, you know, we can talk to anyone, anywhere in the world, 24/7, that actually this does have some problems in relation to work-life balance, in particular, in relation to workload, burnout, and mental health. So it is important to think about some of the downsides of technology use as well. Okay, right, let's move on to the next one. Hybrid working. So this is really the one I think that everyone is talking about. And I think it was by far, when I asked you to type in the chat, it was something about flexibility or hybrid working was probably the thing that came up the most in the chat just a few minutes ago. And of course, we've seen, I've tried to put on this slide headlines from across time, because I think we started with conversations about no one's ever going back to the office. We're all working remotely, to no, all of our people are coming back to the office, to none of our people are coming back to the office. And then we've moved into this conversation that's very much about hybrid working and how we can transform our organizations for hybrid. And then most recently, And I don't know if any of you saw the article in the FT last week or the week before that said, well, it's time to admit that hybrid is not working. So we seem to have jumped from preparing for hybrid to giving up on hybrid within the space of about 6 months, which fascinates me. But really, there's a whole very mixed rhetoric around this topic, where it's fantastic, it's impossible, everyone should be back in the office. So there's a really mixed rhetoric here. So let's just think about what the data shows, because the data is actually also very clear here. The data shows overwhelmingly, and has held up quite well over time, that around 3/4 of people would prefer hybrid working in the future. I'm citing some work from the Institute for Employment Studies here, but actually you see across different surveys this same figure of around 3/4. You're also seeing that most firms are saying that they're going to do something about it. And of course, we have had some very big headlines with people from Goldman Sachs and others saying, no, our people are all coming back to the office. We're not letting people work at home. But actually, most organizations are trying to adopt hybrid working. There are some differences in sectors. So IT, perhaps not surprisingly, much more at home, much more remote working. But law, some of the more traditional sectors, perhaps around law and finance, much more likely to go back to the office. But we are beginning to see from some of the data out there that there is a risk, I think, in organizations that are not introducing hybrid, that they will lose their employees. And we are beginning to see some data that supports that. The other thing I just wanted to highlight here is that we often talk about hybrid as though it's open to everyone. And of course, it's really, really important to realize that it's actually less than half of those in employment who are in the kind of jobs where they can work from home. So actually, this is, most people, more than half, are unable to work at home, at least can't do all of their job at home. And it's really important to remember, I think, that the whole conversation about hybrid work isn't valid for everybody. And there are, of course, some different challenges for industries that are reliant on frontline workers. And a couple of things I want to say about the implications, and I'm not going to go through all of these because I think they've been quite well talked about in the media and in the HR press. The point I really did want to make here about hybrid working is because there is a bit of a rhetoric out there that says, well, we've been working at home for nearly 2 years now, so actually this is easy. It's really easy for us because, we've got the technology now and we know that we can manage with people at home and we know we can communicate, so hybrid working shouldn't be a problem. And this is a rhetoric that I have seen, and it's just not true. There is a very big difference between having all of your office workers at home, because actually that's relatively easy. Once you've got the communication in place, the technology in place, it's relatively easy to manage. Having some people at home and some people in the office is a very, very different ball game, and brings up a lot of implications and a lot of challenges that aren't there when we have people at home all the time. It's actually one of my bugbears when people say we've been working flexibly for the last 2 years, because there's absolutely nothing flexible, as those of you that have been in that position will agree, I'm sure. There's nothing flexible about being forced to work at home. So, and the important thing, of course, with hybrid working is to bring back in that element of choice and flexibility that helps us to engage workers and satisfy their needs. And so we can really, see improved productivity and engagement and satisfaction. There's a whole lot of challenges related to that, and I'm not going to go through all of these. The ones that I do want to talk about really are around performance management and around equality and inclusion. Because I think the other things are pretty obvious. We've heard lots of conversations about communication and collaboration, lots about people's facilities at home, and lots of conversations, I think, about the informal stuff. How do we facilitate that informal communication and so on and so forth? What we perhaps talk less about is, how do we support our managers, our line managers, to manage their teams when they can't see people anymore. Because for some managers, that's really, really difficult, because managers are used to having their teams around them. Not in all industries, I know, but as a generalization in a lot of industries, you know, managers are used to being co-located with their teams, or being able to, you know, for them to be relatively visible. It's really challenging for many managers to manage performance when they can't see people, because it means they have to think about a more outcomes focused. They have to look at outcomes rather than, you know, kind of being able to wander around and see what people are doing. The other thing that's important with that is that we know from years of evidence around remote working that actually people that aren't visible get fewer opportunities. They're often not promoted. They're not included in development activity. They're often not included in conversations because people just don't think about updating them or trying to include them in conversations that are happening face to face. And this has a real impact on equality and inclusion. So I really, you know, just to highlight that one thing here, I think it's really important that we do think about how we can make sure people are included and keep that inclusive culture that most organizations are striving towards when we're in a hybrid environment. Okay, so I want to move on to talk a bit about attitudes, and a couple of you posted stuff about generations. For those of you that are looking at this slide and going, oh, I've seen this before, I am not going to talk about these generational groups. I'm just putting this up as an example. Some of you will have seen me talk about this before, so you will know very well what I'm about to say. Normally, when we talk about workforce attitudes, this is the kind of thing that we see. Okay, so over the last 20 years, certainly, we've had a lot of conversations that focus very much on this idea of generations, that there are different groups in the workforce that behave in a different way, that want different things, that have different attitudes and expectations of the workplace. And of course, you know, so typically we've talked about these 4 generations. We're now over the last few years begun to talk much more about Generation Z, or the Alpha generation, who again have, you know, are named as having very different attitudes or expectations at work. And I just pulled out a couple of real headlines, which I've pulled off of online articles, that illustrate, I think, the way that this is often presented. So let's just look at this one for a minute. This one is about millennials, so about Generation Y. So they have a different world, a different worldview. Millennials have grown up in a time of rapid change, giving them a set of priorities and expectations sharply different from previous generations. And this is the idea that really sits behind generational diversity, that we have a group of people that are sharply different. So in this case, born between about 1980 and 1999, that are sharply different from previous generations. And in the management and HR press, we have a whole load of this as well. So here's another one. Businesses are worrying about how to manage different age groups with widely different expectations. So there's that idea again, widely different. And you will know that there are industries that have cropped up, and some large consultancy offerings around, you know, how do you manage whatever the latest generation is in the workplace. So I just want to briefly just challenge that for a while. I've spent a lot of time over the last 10, 15 years looking at the evidence behind this idea of generational groups. And actually, it's incredibly weak. So my colleague Peter Irwin and I did this piece of work back in 2011 for the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, in fact. You know, and we looked at all of the evidence at the time around generational differences, and we said, actually, there's lots of problems in this. And I'm not going to talk about this for very long, but those problems really were that if you look at the evidence, there's as much out there that says there aren't differences between generations as there is that says there are differences. And if you start digging into what the differences are, nobody agrees. Nobody agrees with the characteristics that you ascribe to the different generations. And then if you start looking at the methodology, which I won't get into lots of problems again. It's very flawed. So actually we concluded, and we've gone on more recently to be even stronger in our language about this, in fact, that actually you might want to ignore this. Another colleague, David Costanza in the US, they looked statistically at all of the evidence of the difference between millennials and Generation X. And they said, actually, do you know what? The differences are moderate to small, essentially zero in most cases. So again, the evidence here is really weak that these differences between groups really holds out. That said, we do know that attitudes towards work are changing, because we know that our attitudes are a reflection of the context that we live in. So we know, of course, that as the context changes, and we're back to context again, that of course attitudes will change. But the evidence suggests that this is happening gradually and incrementally over time. We're not seeing these big step changes between generations. So it is important for us to think about the future and how the context might affect the attitudes of the people we're trying to employ, if we're in that position. What do people want from work? What are their expectations? But really, this idea of comparing groups and treating them like unique cohorts really doesn't work. And the other thing that's important here is that actually everyone's attitudes are changing. So, so your attitudes and my attitudes are changing as well in relation to what we expect in the workforce. Attitudes around things like flexibility, technology, feedback and employee voice, these are all changing over time for all of us and are expected to continue into the future. And I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail, but just to summarize some of those, because some of you will be saying, well, great, Emma, but what are the attitudes that are changing? Again, this is based on some research that I've done, again, pulling together all of the literature that's out there and some of the survey data about attitudes that's out there. There are a number of big trends out there that we can be relatively confident will carry on into the future. These are things like increased emphasis on, on social and environmental issues. We have the younger people entering the workforce now, have this real tendency towards activism. They're really, really willing to stick up for what they want. And again, we're seeing that change across the workforce. So actually, so things like corporate social responsibility and sustainability become more important. We talked a bit about flexible working. We know that especially since the pandemic, we've got increased expectations around flexible working and this idea of nomadism, where you can actually work from anywhere on the beach in Bali, which always sounds lovely to me, rather than having to be in the office. Other things we're seeing is this demand for careers that have meaning. And again, that's across the whole workforce. So actually, why pay and progression are still important, we're really seeing an increase in people that want to make a difference, whether that's in the organizations or whether that's actually in broader society. So really, people are looking for careers that allow them to satisfy a calling or to make some difference. And then just to pull one more out of these, because I think some of these we've already touched on and are more obvious. The other one is around employee voice and participation. And I'll just use this to highlight how these relate to the changing context. So we're seeing a real increase in an expectation that people can have a say in the way the organization they work in is run, and some sort of participation in decision making. And if you think back to parenting styles and you think about technology, we can see how this has come about. When I was a child, it was very much about being seen and not heard. Parenting now really encourages young people to have a voice and to speak, and of course that affects people's expectations as they get older. And of course, the other thing that's happened is we have social media. So of course we can have a voice on anything at any time by using social media and by using social media sites. And these things have really affected our expectation of the voice that we have in organizations. So I think this one is a really nice example of how context might drive what we expect at work. Okay, I just want to talk really briefly about the Great Resignation. And this is less of a long-term trend, but it is one that everyone is talking about at the moment. So I did want to throw it in there as just a final comment. These are literally, it took me 2 or 3 minutes to find these 4 headlines, because literally this is all over the press at the moment. This idea that everyone, you know, as we come out of the pandemic or get to this stage of the pandemic anyway, that, you know, that people are leaving their jobs and actually, you know, organizations are struggling to hold on to people. So I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes just thinking a little bit about this. And the easiest way to illustrate this is to also, of course, to show you a chart that shows you what's actually happening. And this is the UK data. So we can see very clearly here that we have got a big uptick in relation to people changing jobs or leaving their job here. A couple of things to say about that. Firstly, I think the other thing that's obvious to me when I look at this graph is that actually prior to that, we had quite a big downtick in people leaving their jobs. So actually, and one argument is that why we are seeing, you know, a massive rise in people resigning at the moment, actually, if those two, you know, pretty much, if they were combined, they pretty much represent a continuation of the trend we had already. So this is really a reflection of people that weren't leaving their jobs during the pandemic to some degree. That said, we do know from some survey data and some more anecdotal evidence that's out there that some people have reflected on their jobs during the pandemic. And we know from psychology, of course, that people in times of crisis do sit back and reflect. And we know that actually, you know, some people have decided, you know, I'm not paid enough. You know, my employer doesn't look after me. Actually, I want to do something with more meaning. And we're seeing a lot of that. We're seeing people perhaps in industries that are at risk, or people in frontline jobs deciding that they want to move into something else. So we are seeing some churn in the labour market that's come about as a result of people reflecting during the pandemic. But really, it's not as dramatic as the rhetoric or the media headlines would suggest, because really we're seeing a continuation of trends if we take into account the downturn in resignations that we had earlier. Okay, and then finally, I just wanted to bring this all together, because one of the things I think when we talk about the future of work, what we're often trying to think about, or the question we're often asking is, well, how do I, you know, what do I need to do to recruit and retain and, you know, keep my workforce happy, engage my workforce, and make sure, you know, and maintain the employee experience in the future. And I think as employers and HR people, we're often very worried that we, you know, that we're not going to be able to do that. So if we look at this slide, which is really a summary of the things that the evidence suggests are important to employees in the future, up to, you know, up to 2030, 2035 probably. Just a couple of things to say about this before I finish. Firstly, not that much has changed. And I'd really like to say that, you know, because things like career development, well-being, equitable pay, you know, an inclusive and supportive culture, these are the things that employees have wanted for a long time. And yes, there is more emphasis on some of these. So yes, we have a stronger emphasis at the moment on flexibility and work-life balance. We have a growing emphasis on sustainability and responsibility, and how our organizations are responding to the challenges placed by climate change. We have a growing emphasis on meaningful work and wanting to make a difference. Again, not a new thing, but it's something that's growing. And of course, we have lots of questions about employee well-being at the moment as we come out of the pandemic, and we face problems around workload and burnout, and so on and so forth. But most of these things aren't that new. The important one for me that sits at the middle of all of this is that one in the bottom middle again, which is really about trust. And for me, you know, employment is about a relationship, and it's really about how can we build a relationship with our employees that's based on trust. And a lot of these things tie into that, you know, and the success of a lot of the kind of organizational changes that we're grappling with around automation, around making a success of hybrid working, around some of the changes and some of the problems that we're facing in organizations because of uncertainty. The way to address those is fundamentally about building a culture and work relationships that are based on trust. So I just want to leave you with that. If I leave you with one message, then that's the thing to think about. And there you go. Any questions?
There have been some great questions and comments coming through in the chat box. Maybe a few statements, and maybe I can read out one to you here first. It relates to what you just said. This is from Owese Oku, who said, in the emerging new norm, performance management needs to be more focused on delivery rather than visibility, which I guess relates to your comment on trust there.
Yeah, absolutely. And trust is really, really central when we talk about hybrid working and performance management in relation to hybrid working or remote working. I agree with that comment completely. And actually, I think that move is a good thing. I mean, for too long, we've made performance decisions and decisions about opportunities based on what we can see people doing. And actually, it should be about what outcomes are people producing, are they delivering? So I think that's a positive thing, but it is about trusting people, that I can't see them, but I trust that they're still going to deliver. And that's quite difficult for some people.
Yeah. There was a comment from Frank O'Sullivan as well, where he mentioned, I feel hybrid needs to be a spectrum rather than binary or an absolute where to work and what to work, which I thought was an interesting comment.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well, Aidan. I think it's, we do. I mean, it's much simpler, isn't it, for us to talk in black and white terms, but of course it's not black and white. And I agree completely. It is a spectrum.
Yeah. There was a question here from Rich Ward, where he said it would be great to hear Emma's thoughts on workplace design.
Oh, how long have you got? There's some really interesting work going on about workplace design at the moment, actually, because I think we are in both workplace design and organization design, which are obviously, I think, two sides of the same thing. I think one thing that is clear, without getting into a very lengthy conversation about how we go about workplace design, is that the function of workplaces is changing. So, it used to be that we would come, I have to say, I'm sitting in a room on my own at work at the moment, which is actually quite odd because I already feel as though that's not what work should be about. We used to come in, we used to sit at our desks, sometimes in lots of desks in an open plan office and do our work. I think there is a real realization, both by individuals and organizations, that that's not necessary anymore. But face-to-face time is still important, often for things like relationship building, collaboration, building teams. We know that some of these things are difficult or more difficult when we're not face-to-face. So for me, workplace design really, really needs to first think about what is the purpose of our workplace now? What will it be in the future? And then how can we design this to facilitate that? And I do think it's always Google, isn't it? But I do think that the way that Google has recently released the kind of design of their new office and the way that they've really thought about hybrid and how are we going to facilitate people interacting. And of course, you would expect them to be much better technologically than most of us. But, and how can we really promote collaboration, I think that's really important. And we saw this start, kind of 5-10 years ago, organizations started putting together places with bean bags and table football and saying, oh, we're going to have people in so that they, interact and make friends. I think it's moved much beyond that. And it's really thinking about how do we design our workplace in a way that's actually about a different sort of work.
Yeah. And there's another challenging question that came through, which is, what do you see as the most important ingredients in creating and supporting trust-based leadership? I think it's quite a big topic as well.
It is. Yeah, and I'm aware that I've touched on lots of things here without really answering any of the questions, because all of these subjects, of course, could have a, I could do this, a whole webinar on each of them. For me, it's really simple. It's actually about talking. I mean, it's about communication, and that sounds like such a cliche, but it really is about facilitating open two-way communication. So dialogue, not like senior management informing people, and about really allowing people that, developing a culture where people feel that they've got that psychological safety to be able to speak up, to be able to say when they're having problems with mental health, when something's going wrong in the workplace, when, and to be able to really have those conversations. So for me, it's very much about open two-way communication. And that's where trust will come from. Too often, I think, in organizations and in HR as well, we do things that are a bit smoke and mirrors. We make decisions without explaining why, on pay, on talent management, on all sorts of things. And actually, it's really about openness, transparency, and communication for me.
That's great. There was a question from John around, thanks for the great session, Emma. Any examples of companies who are getting it right?
Getting it all right? No. No, I mean, I think there are some companies that are doing, that are doing good things with bits of this. I think there are, I mean, I have to say, typically the companies that you see that are doing really good things are smaller companies, because I think with some of this, and with trust in particular, that informality helps. I think at the moment, especially with things like hybrid, I think there are a lot of companies that have the right intentions and that are going about it in the right way. I don't really want to name any at the moment, because I have a feeling if I name one in 2 years' time, they'll be all over the news for it being a disaster. And I don't want to break any confidences, but I do think there are some companies that are, that are going about it the right way and talking about their staff and really asking what they want. But in terms of doing it all right, no, it's difficult. I mean, I think we have to realize that there's no magic pill here. It's all difficult. So,
yeah, there was a really interesting comment earlier from Kerry Outlaw, which I think is worth taking a bit of time on, where she said that I really don't get the idea of fitting people into boxes associated with their age and generation. I think we all evolve based upon our lives and life events and our environment and our opportunities. And so it's good to hear that many of these ideas are being proved materially incorrect. And there was a few similar comments around that where you brought up the actual data to show and challenge those perspectives.
Yes, Kerry, that's music to my ears. I couldn't have, any of you that have heard me talk about this before know that I'm very capable of ranting about that for some time, which I won't do on this call because it is something that I feel quite strongly about, but I completely agree. And of course, we do that a lot within organizations because it's easier. I mean, it's, the ideal is to treat our employees or to treat people as individuals, but actually that's very difficult to do. I mean, again, it's down to communication, of course, but that's quite difficult to do. So we create these heuristics or these shortcuts where we kind of try and say, well, they're in that box, so this must be what they want. But actually the evidence around generational groups shows that actually there are more differences within the groups than between them. So actually that just proves the point, really, that actually putting people in the groups isn't useful. And actually it can lead to real problems. I mean, someone else in the chat I noticed is saying, is this about age? Well, yes, ultimately. And of course, it can lead to problems around age stereotyping and age bias. And, it can lead to some real problems that we've been trying to avoid for the last 20 years. So.
Yeah, there's so many great comments that have been put in here. I feel like we could continue the discussion for a long time. Maybe just time for one more question. There was one, what is your view, Emma, on leadership-centric approach to strategy to drive engagement?
What is my view on a leadership-centric approach to strategy to drive engagement? It would depend on what you mean by that. I think that's quite a... I mean, I think leadership is just trying to second guess what that person means by this. I mean, I think leadership, I haven't talked a lot about leadership with this because I think, not because I don't think it's important, because it really feeds into everything that I've talked about, I think. And I think, I mean, leadership is obviously central to this. Leaders develop the culture. But leadership centric, I would prefer what I would call a human centric approach, which is not just about leaders. I mean, for me, I would talk about a human centric or a people centric approach where we should be building strategies around leaders. I mean, too often we develop a strategy and then try and think about how that fits with the people in the organization. And I think it should. So I would move towards a human-centric approach rather than a leadership-centric approach, I think.
Yeah, that
I feel
makes sense.
I've answered a cryptic question with a cryptic answer there, Adrian.
I think maybe this is the type of a discussion that could have a lot more time to it.
Yeah, and I am very happy. Sorry, Adrian. I'm very happy. You know, if people do want to have this discussion, then please do get in touch, because I hope one thing you can see today is that this is a topic that I love and I'm, incredibly enthusiastic about. So please do get in touch if people do want to have more conversations about it. I'm very happy for that.
Yeah, maybe just one more piece to ask your advice on. There were a few comments around how prepared governments are for the changing world, and a few comments around the UK government. I don't know if you have any comments there.
Oh, that's a bit of a can of worms to open right at the end there, I think.
Sorry.
I think how prepared are the government?
Yeah, around tax implications for hybrid working or working overseas, all these types of things, how prepared they are.
I don't think they are, to be completely honest with you. I mean, I think ideally we would be in a situation where legislation drives change. I think too often actually we're in a situation where organizations drive legislative change, and it should be the other way around. So my short answer, and of course there's some variance about this, but my short answer would be that they're not, and there needs to be much more thought given to that. Although I guess they may be thinking about other stuff at the moment.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, I think I've thrown enough curveballs at you at the end there. So thank you so much for taking the time. We really appreciate the session. And there's been so many nice comments in the chat box as well, thanking you for your time and saying that it was a great session. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And also thank you to everyone who's joining today and listening in and connecting to this session. We appreciate that you've taken the time for this. So we can wrap up now. And if you've enjoyed the session, then we encourage you to register for the next installment, which is in our Future of Everything series. That event will be on Wednesday, the 11th of May, and our speaker will be Dr. Rosina Watson, who's the head of the Sustainability Group and Senior Lecturer in Sustainability here. So please follow us on LinkedIn. You can get regular updates and look for the invitation in your inbox. But for now, thank you to everyone, wherever you are in the world. We wish you had a great day. Thank you so much to Professor Emma Parry. It was amazing to listen to you. And we hope to see everyone again very soon. But yeah, thanks to everyone and have a good day.